Keith, whenever you're ready.
All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's Talmud class. The rabbi's class is sponsored by the Susser Foundation, the Skiba family, the Sheeran family, and in memory of Libby and Harold Grill.
Thank you very much, Keith. Thank you, everyone, for joining me once again. And tonight, we will continue a little bit the conversation we started some meetings ago, in which we spoke about the Reform, the Conservative, and the Orthodox movements in general. Last week, or last meeting, actually, we did together a dive into the Reform and the Orthodox movements on their attitudes towards Halakha. How do they deal with Halakha? And today we are going to concentrate in the conservative movement. So what we are going to do, we are going to read one article on the attitude of the conservative movement toward Halakha. And we will give here some examples on things that the conservative movement has chosen to advance in terms of Halakha, and things that I see that in the near future, the conservative movement will need to deal with. What are the next halachic advancements that are going to happen within the conservative movement, in my opinion, as I see by the debates among conservative rabbis. So before we start diving into the conservative movement and the conservative approach to Halakha, I want to share a chart with you. So here you see an oversimplified chart on the several different movements. And as you see here, there is an emphasis in Jewish thought, in philosophy, in the liberal reform and Masorti movement, whereas we recognize that the Masorti Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox movements will emphasize, will highlight practice. So we may say, and once again, we are simplifying here, that liberal and reform Judaism are more preoccupied with Jewish thought than with Jewish practice. And Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox movements are more preoccupied with Jewish practice than with Jewish thought. And our movement, the Masorti conservative movement, is somehow here in the middle, in between. So we are concerned about Jewish thought because we understand that Jewish thought impacts our practice. And we are also concerned with practice. Maybe we are a little bit less concerned with practice than the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox movements, and a little bit less concerned with thought than the liberal and reform movements, but still the Masorti conservative movement is the place when thought and practice come together. So Halacha in Conservative Judaism. So I need a volunteer to start reading our article. You don't need to read the entire thing, but start reading, and then someone else can take from there. We are talking about a 3 pages article. Who wants to start?
I'll start.
Great, Keith. Thank you so much.
Tradition and change is the conservative movement's motto, balancing adherence to Jewish law with a willingness to introduce major innovations. This article is excerpted from a statement of principles issued in 1988 by the major institutions of the North American arm of the conservative movement, known outside North America as the Masorti traditional movement. Reprinted with permission from Emet Ve'emunah, Statement of Principles of Conservative Judaism, published by the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the Rabbinical Assembly, the United Synagogue of America, now called United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, Women's League for Conservative Judaism, and Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs. That's a mouthful just for a disclaimer. The sanctity and authority of halakha attaches to the body of the law, not to each law separately. For throughout the Jewish history, halakha has been subject to change. Reverence for the tradition and concern for its continuity prevented rash revision of the law, but Jewish practice was modified from time to time. Most often, new interpretations or application of existing precedents produced the needed development, but sometimes new ordinances were necessary. Sometimes, as in the education of girls and the creation of the Simchat Torah festival, the changes occurred first in the conduct of the rabbis of the people, and only then were confirmed in law.
Okay. Is there someone else that would like to take from here? Tradition and development in halacha. Hannah, thank you.
Yeah. The rabbis of the Mishnah, the Talmud, and Midrash recognized that changes had occurred and that they themselves were instituting them. They took pains to justify the legitimacy of rabbis in each generation, applying the law in new ways to meet the demands of the time. They pointed out that the Torah itself requires such judicial activity, a mandate which they interpreted broadly to include at times even outright revisions of the law.
So, Hannah, just to clarify here, so the article starts saying that the idea of an halacha that evolves is not a new idea, because the rabbinic literature, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara is already a reinterpretation of halacha. They are reading the Torah, taking into consideration the context of their lives. So when conservative rabbis decide to reinterpret, to read again, to adjust, to adapt halacha, they are not actually doing new stuff. They are continuing what the rabbis did in the past, in the time of the Mishnah, in the time of the Gemara. So the idea of updating, revisiting, and sometimes changing halacha is not a new idea. This is something that always existed in Judaism. Yes, Hannah, please.
Each individual cannot be empowered to make changes in the law, for that would undermine its authority and coherence. Only the rabbinical leaders of the community, because of their knowledge of the content, aims, and methods of halakha, are authorized by Jewish tradition to make the necessary changes, although they must keep the customs and needs of the community in mind as they deliberate.
So, changes are necessary, but we need to change in an organized fashion, in an organized way, because if each and every individual starts saying, you know what, I am changing this, I'm changing that, we will stop being a group. We will stop being a people. We will stop being a religion. So we recognize that change is important, but how to change is also very important. And the idea here is that we are changing or we are evolving, we are revisiting halacha as a group, in our case, as a movement, as a conservative movement. So we have a specific body that will study and decide whether we need to change or not specific halachot. In the reform movement, we are talking much more of an individual decision in an individual work, because the autonomy of the individual is absolutely central, is absolutely key for the reform movement. So there are changes that the reform movement do as a movement, but still each and every individual is encouraged to take his or her own decisions on halacha. And here in the conservative movement, there is an attempt to address halacha in a more organized and collective way. Yes, Hannah, please.
Okay. We in the conservative community are committed to carrying on the rabbinic tradition of preserving and enhancing halacha by making appropriate changes in it through rabbinic decision. This flows from our conviction that, that halacha.
That halacha is.
Okay, that's that halacha is indispensable for each age. As in the past, the nature and number of adjustments of the law will vary with the degree of change in the environment in which Jews live.
Great. And here I want to highlight the idea that we are preserving and enhancing halacha at the same time. And there is a tension there, because sometimes by enhancing, you are not preserving. And sometimes by preserving, you are not enhancing. But you need, the movement needs to choose in every specific case whether they are going to enhance or to preserve. And this tension is always present. I think that the reform movement will much more easily enhance everything, because the reform movement feels less committed to preserving. And the Orthodox movement will try hardly to preserve everything and not to enhance. And the conservative movement decided to live with the conflict, with the tension, and study every single case and see whether they want to preserve or to enhance in the specific example in front of them. The rapid technological
and social change of our time, as well as new ethical insights and goals, have required new interpretations and applications of halacha to keep it vital for our lives. More adjustments will undoubtedly be necessary in the future. These include additions to the received tradition to deal with new circumstances, and in some cases, modifications of the corpus of halacha.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Do we have a third reader?
I'll read.
Thank you so much, Sandy.
Regulating change. While change is both a traditional and a necessary part of Holocaust, we, like our ancestors, are not committed to change for its own sake. Hence, the thrust of the Jewish tradition and the conservative community is to maintain the law and practices of the past as much as possible, and the burden of proof is on the one who wants to alter them.
Thank you. So just to highlight here, change is not a value on itself. Change sometimes will be necessary, but we don't approach halacha saying we are here to change, we came here to change everything. We actually would try to maintain as much as possible, but sometimes maintaining is impossible, makes life difficult, causes some conflicts with other values. So change by itself is not a value. Here the phrase is, we are not committed to change for its own sake. We will change when it proves necessary to change. Yes.
Continue.
Please, Sandy.
Halakha has responded and must continue to respond to changing conditions, sometimes through alteration of the law and sometimes by standing firm against passing fads and skewed values. Moreover, the necessity for change does not justify any particular proposal for revision. Each suggestion cannot be treated mechanically, but must rather be judged in its own terms, a process which requires thorough knowledge of both halakha and the contemporary scene, as well as carefully honed skills of judgment.
So this is also very, very important. Every paragraph here is rich and important to be understood if we want to understand the conservative approach to halakha. So here, the last line we just read together is a process which requires thorough knowledge of both halakha and the contemporary scene. So the Orthodox legislators will try not to be impacted by the contemporary scene when they are legislating halakha. So they will try to legislate halakha taking into consideration halakha only, and not the contemporary scene. Whereas the reform movement will take the contemporary scene as the most important thing that exists. The contemporary scene sets the values by which the Jews need to live according to Reform Judaism. So contemporary scene and contemporary values, such as democracy, for instance, are the most important thing. And we need to adjust halakha to the contemporary scene. And the Orthodox movement will say the opposite. Actually, we need to adjust the contemporary scene to halakha because halakha is eternal. Halakha was given by God. How can we change halakha? We cannot touch halakha. We need to adjust our lives to halakha. And the reform movement will say, no, we need to adjust halakha to our lives. And the conservative movement will say, you know what? We need to establish a dialogue between halakha and the contemporary scene. And sometimes halakha will prevail. And sometimes the contemporary scene will prevail. But we don't come to this conversation with a result. We come to this conversation trying to judge every case, every question, every she'elah in its own terms. Next one, please, Sandy.
Following the example of our rabbinic predecessors over the ages, however, we consider instituting changes for a variety of reasons. Occasionally, the integrity of the law must be maintained by adjusting it to conform to contemporary practice among observant Jews. Every legal system from time to time must adjust what is on the books to be in line with actual practice if the law is to be taken seriously as a guide to conduct. New technological, social, economic, or political realities sometimes require legal action. Some changes in law are designed to improve the material conditions of the Jewish people or society at large. The goal of others is to foster better relations among Jews or between Jews and the larger community. In some cases, changes are necessary to prevent or remove injustice, while in others, they constitute a positive program to enhance the quality of Jewish life by elevating its moral standards or deepening its piety.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Let's see if we find an additional reader. This is the last few paragraphs. Anyone? No? Stephen? Okay, Stephen, thank you.
Okay. A normal halachic development is insufficient. We affirm that the halachic process has striven to embody the highest moral principles. Where changing conditions produce what seem to be immoral consequences and human anguish, various approaches. I lost my place. Within our community to rectify the situation. What is deemed possible and desirable to solve the problem through the existing halakhic norms, we prefer to use them. If not, some within conservative community are prepared to amend the existing law by means of a formal procedure of legislation known as takana. Some are willing to make a change only when they find it justified by sources in the halachic literature. All of us, however, are committed to the indispensability of Jewish living.
Of halakha, indispensability of halakha for authentic Jewish living. And I just want to highlight here before the last paragraph that they bring here in this paragraph two possibilities. One is the possibility to amend the existing law by means of a formal procedure of legislation called takana. So takana happens when you say, you know what, there is no Jewish way to solve this question. We need a new law. We need to amend the law. And we do a takana. And the rabbis did it in the past. One of the most famous takanot is the prohibition to marry several women in Judaism. So I explained recently to the minyan, until the year 1000, it was allowed for a Jew male, for a Jew man, to marry several women until the year 1000. So we are talking about 1000 years ago. Until 1000 years ago, until the year 1023 years ago, a Jewish male could marry several women because this is what the Bible allows. And there is no Jewish way within the Jewish sources to change it. So a takana, a new law, an amendment was necessary. And it was only for the Ashkenazic world, because the Sephardim kept on marrying several women until the beginning of the 20th century, because they lived in Arab countries in which it was totally acceptable. So this is an example of a change that it was not possible to make using the Jewish sources, the Jewish tools, because there wasn't any precedent. This was new, totally new. So a takana was necessary. And when we continue in this paragraph, we say some are willing to make a change only when they find it justified by sources in the halachic literature. So this is a different kind of change. This is not a takana, but a change based on the Jewish halachic literature. You will say, you know what, we are practicing this way, but there are different Jewish ways to practice. And we make a change that take into consideration another Jewish way to do it, to doing it. But sometimes there is no other Jewish way to doing it, and you need to innovate. And this innovation is called takana. Last paragraph, please, Stephen.
Okay. Our dedication to halacha flows from our deep awareness of divine element and the positive values inherent in it. Every effort is made to conserve and enhance it. When changes are necessary, they are made with the express goal of ensuring that halacha remains an effective, viable, and moral guide for our lives.
Thank you very much. So now I want to use this last half hour of our meeting to give you some examples and to explain how the conservative movement has dealt with halacha during the last few years, and what are the challenges ahead, at least in my opinion. One very important change happened in the conservative movement when driving to synagogue became allowed, became permitted. And this was a major change, because then this resolution, and it was a big debate and a lot of fight inside the conservative movement. This change made it clear that we are not necessarily following the Orthodox halacha, but we are willing to have our own approach to halacha. And sometimes this approach will differ from the Orthodox approach to halacha. So this was a major change that happened to the conservative movement, a tshuva, a responsa, allowing Jews to drive to the synagogue. So the idea is that many Jews live far away from the synagogue, and the only way for them to be connected to their community, to their congregation, would be driving a car. And then the conservative movement decided that if you need to drive a car in order to get to your synagogue, you are allowed to do so. And the tshuva is very clear in saying we are not allowing driving in Shabbat in general. We are not allowing you to take your car to go to the supermarket or to go to the movies or to go to, but in order to go to the synagogue, in order to be connected to Judaism, to be connected to Shabbat, you are allowed to drive your car. And today in the conservative movement, there are several Jews who drive their cars to go to synagogue, including some conservative rabbis who do not live very close to their synagogue, to their congregation, and they drive their cars in order to get to the synagogue. Here I live in 8 Howland, so I don't need to drive my car to get to the synagogue. It's so fast. Actually, if I drove my car, it would take more than coming than walking to the synagogue. So I don't have this this question here, but many colleagues do have, and they've decided to drive on Shabbat to get to their synagogue, and this is something that the conservative movement allows. After this decision, the two big decisions of the conservative movement in recent years were the first one regarding women, so egalitarianism in general, and the ordination of female rabbis in particular, was revolutionary in the conservative movement. And once again, the conservative movement started a new path, different from the Orthodox movement, but very similar to the Reform movement, because the Reform movement did the same thing some years before. Took a little longer to the conservative movement to study the sources, to revisit legislation, but to reach the same place. And today, the conservative movement is an egalitarian movement. The vast majority of the conservative synagogues in the world are egalitarian. There are some exceptions, some of them here on Long Island. Long Island seems to be a place in which some conservative synagogues still resist in absorbing women as an integral part of their congregation, counting them for minyan, allowing them to read from the Torah, and so on and so forth. But as a movement, the conservative movement is an egalitarian movement, and it ordains women as it ordains men. And the next big step was ordaining homosexuals and performing marriages of an homosexual couple. And this was the next big issue for the conservative movement. Again, the Reform movement changed before, and the conservative movement spent years in debates, in conversations, and so on and so forth. And then they came with to the conclusion that the conservative movement must ordain homosexual rabbis, and conservative rabbis are allowed to perform in homosexual weddings and lead and perform homosexual unions, homosexual weddings. Just to tell you a personal story, when I was studying in Jerusalem to become a rabbi, there was a friend in my class who is an homosexual. And back then, 20 years ago, it wasn't allowed to reveal his homosexuality. And if he did it, he would be expelled from the rabbinical school. And so he had to keep it in secret, and he could not tell anyone, and he just could not make it. He could not reach the ordination, because for him it was too much to live a life that of lie, in which he could not be who he is. So he left the rabbinical school, because he just could not keep it that way. Afterwards, he went to a private smicha, to a private ordination, and today he's a rabbi. I know him, we are in contact. But back then, in the conservative movement, they would not ordain homosexual rabbis. Today, the conservative movement, yes, ordains homosexual rabbis and ordains women too. When I look in the direction of the future and I ask myself, what are the big next questions? I think there are two main questions awaiting us, and several small ones, but two big questions, two main questions. And actually, those two main questions that I want now to share with you are the ones who differentiate today the conservative movement from the reform movement, Those two questions are the most important differences between the reform and the conservative movements. I see at this point that some of you know already what I am talking about. Barbara, if you want to unmute yourself and say yes.
I think rabbis marrying into marriage. Is that part of it? Because
No
the conservatives are not allowed to, and some who did, I think, had to leave the movement, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, you are totally right. So one of those questions that will be addressed very, very soon in the conservative movement is the permission to conservative rabbis to perform intermarriage, to marry a Jew with a non-Jew. And today, it's forbidden. As Barbara said, if a conservative rabbi today performs in an intermarriage, he or she is expelled from the rabbinical assembly, from the rabbis' union. We cannot be a conservative rabbi and perform in an intermarriage. As for today, there was a small update in this question recently, because until very recently, the conservative rabbi could not even be present to an intermarriage ceremony. So if the brother of the conservative rabbi would have an intermarriage ceremony with another rabbi, the brother could not be there, could not be present. Or if a child of a conservative rabbi would have an intermarriage, the rabbi could not be present, could not be there. because being there was understood by the conservative movement as some kind of approval of that situation. So it changed very recently, and today the conservative rabbi can be there if it's a very close person and he or she feels that he must be there or she must be there, they will be there, but still they cannot perform. And probably in the near future, this will be the hot topic. It is already. I think it is already the hot topic in the conservative movement. The possibility or not to perform a marriage, a wedding ceremony between a Jewish person and a non-Jewish person who is not converting to Judaism. If the other person is converting to Judaism, we are talking about a Jewish marriage and we have no problem. But we are specifically talking about a case in which one of the two is not Jewish and will not become a Jewish. Whether a conservative rabbi can or not perform that ceremony. Today, it's not allowed. It is forbidden. Someday it may change. This is one question that still differentiates the reform and the conservative movement. But there is another one, very, very strong and important too. And I'm talking about patrilineal descent. So today, for the reform movement, if you have a Jewish parent, regardless of being the Jewish parent, your mother or your father, you can be considered a Jew. For the conservative movement and for the Orthodox movement, it must be the mother. The mother only determines if the offspring is Jewish or not. So the father does not have a role here, does not have a say here for the Orthodox and conservative movement. For the Reform movement, a rabbi and a congregation are allowed to recognize the Judaism of a person if they are the son or daughter of a Jewish parent, and this Jewish parent can be the father or the mother, or both, obviously. The only thing that the Reform rabbi and the Reform congregation will require is a Jewish education. So if the religion of the family is Judaism and the mother is not Jewish, the son, the child, can be considered 100% Jewish and accepted to the congregation without any conversion. And apparently, this was the Jewish system in the past. So Judaism was passed by father to child until a certain point of development of Judaism. And probably because of the rapes that Jewish women suffered in the time of the Romans, the rabbis decided to change, because a Jewish woman raped by a Roman soldier, when Judaism was passed from father to child, would not be considered Jewish. And it would bring an additional layer of suffer to that woman. So what rabbis did at some point, and this is very controversial because some scholars defend this theory, but it's not everyone. But some scholars defend that at some point, Jewish tradition decided to take out from the man the possibility to pass on Judaism, and they gave it to women. So if it is correct, what the Reform movement is doing is rescuing some old Jewish tradition and saying we are now again considering Judaism from the father. Actually, they are not rescuing 100% because back then it was from the father only. And now what the Reform movement is doing is saying we are recognizing either from father or mother. We don't need both parents to be Jewish. We need only one parent to be Jewish, regardless of being father or mother. So if it's correct, the Reform movement is actually bringing back an old Jewish tradition. And when we read the Bible, we actually it makes some sense, because the man actually was the one who passed to his wife and children his nationality and his language and his identity and religion and everything. So we come from a patriarchal history, and it probably is right, is correct. But the fact is that Halacha evolved, and today both the Orthodox and Conservative movement recognize Judaism by the mother only. So we have a matrilineal descent, and the Reform movement has a patrilineal descent and recognizes Judaism coming from the father or the mother. In terms of demography, of numbers, the impact is huge. Because, as you know, here in the United States, we are talking about 70% more or less of intermarriage, maybe 75% of intermarriage in the non-Orthodox Jewish community. And many Jewish men are marrying non-Jewish women. And the ability to recognize their children as Jewish without demanding any kind of conversion process has a huge impact on the numbers. And this is not by chance that the Reform movement passed the Conservative movement in numbers. And today, the Reform movement is bigger than the Conservative movement. And in the past, it was the opposite. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is then that the Reform movement started to accept patrilineal descent and recognize automatically, without any conversion process, children of a Jewish father, as they recognize children from a Jewish mother. So if you ask me what are the big questions awaiting the conservative movement in the near future, I would say the ability of Jewish clergy to perform in an intermarriage, in a wedding in which one of the two is not Jewish, and the patrilineal descent, the possibility to recognize Judaism of someone whose father only is Jewish. Those are the big questions that await Jewish legislator, conservative Jewish legislator on the next few years. There will be some small questions important to, not very small actually, but smaller than those. And just to give an example, I think that the way that we bury the burial in Judaism will need to be revisited for a very, very simple question. There will be no enough place to bury everyone in the future. So the way we do it today, we have separate burial places for each and every person. And the idea is that it will last forever. So we can see in the near future, we will have more Jews under the ground than on the ground, and the numbers will keep on growing, and we will have more cemeteries than synagogues, than Jewish schools, more cemeteries than everything. So this is something that will need to be revisited at some point, and maybe different Jewish ways of making a funeral, of doing a funeral, will need to be approved to deal with this situation. But this is not only a conservative concern, it will be a concern for Orthodox and for Reform Jews and for everyone. In Jerusalem, this is a problem already, because many Jews in the world decide to be buried in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is becoming a big cemetery, and there is no more place to bury so many people, as many people that want to be buried there. So they are already finding solutions that are more similar to the Christian way to bury, that is one on the top of the other, several bodies in the same grave, in order to save space, in order to being able to allow more people in less space. So this is a question that in the near future will need to be addressed. Question, comments, we still have some few minutes.
Rabbi, don't you think that the first two things you were speaking about regarding patrilineal descent and rabbis performing intermarriage, they go hand in hand? Because how can you perform a marriage and then say to the children that you're not Jewish?
Greg is speaking, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I recognized your voice. Because your identification is iPhone.
Okay.
No, so they are connected. I agree with you, and they are close, but we are still talking about different things. Because in an intermarriage, you can have a situation that the bride is Jewish and the groom is not Jewish, and the offspring is Jewish and will be recognized today by a conservative rabbi. The conservative rabbi cannot perform this marriage, but he will still recognize the offspring as Jewish because the mother is Jewish.
Right, but the flip side is the real connection.
Yes, you are right. It would be difficult to say that a conservative rabbi can perform in a marriage, in an intermarriage, in which only the father only is Jewish, and then the conservative rabbi is not allowed to recognize the offspring as Jewish, despite the fact that he did the marriage. I agree with you. This would be a very odd situation. I totally agree. Yes. Anyone else?
When a decision of this type is decided by the conservative organizations, is there some way of announcing it to the larger community? Or is it
So
not?
this is a very good question, Keith. So the rabbis are informed, and the rabbis will or not abide to the change. So the change does not necessarily obligates the conservative rabbi to follow it. So it's the conservative rabbi is not obligated to perform in an homosexual wedding. He is allowed to. So the change comes as a possibility, not as something that is mandatory. So we, the conservative rabbis, know about every single publication, every single tshuva that is published by the conservative movement, and it's up to us teach this tshuvot, this response to our congregations.
And there's no way that lay people can find out these things without the rabbi informing them?
From time to time, they collect those tshuvot and they publish books with those tshuvot. And if you go to the website of the Rabbinical Assembly, you can find the tshuvot there. The response is there, available to everyone to read. So it's not confidential. Anyone else? Okay, so thank you very much and see you soon.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a good night.
Thank
you very much.
Good night.
Laila Tov.
Good night.